Welcome. Thank you for joining us for PTA Finance, What Treasurers Need to Know. This workshop is part 1 of 2. I am Melinda Kirkland. I am the current California State PTA Treasurer for the 2019 to 21 term. Joining me today are Kathy Corzine, current Leadership Commissioner and PTA Treasurer for the 2017 to 19 term, and Laura Hawk-Loya, who is the current Leadership Commissioner and is the slated nominee for Treasurer for the 2021-23 term. All right. Most important thing to keep in mind as a PTA officer is your fiduciary responsibilities. And this is true for all PTA officers, not just finance officers. You are fiscally responsible to the members of your association, and you must ensure that all financial procedures and laws are followed. All members of the board share this responsibility, and it's important to remember that you have to protect PTA assets, and assets are more than money. They include volunteers and the reputation of your PTA. Here are some financial resources that are available to you. We strongly recommend that you review the finance chapter of the California State PTA Toolkit and look at the most commonly used forms in the toolkit. The toolkit contains procedures and forms that you will need as a treasurer or a financial secretary in PTA. Every officer, including you, should have a copy of and be familiar with your PTA's bylaws. This is very important. There is some information in bylaws that is unique to your PTA, so it's not something that you can go find online. You need to have a copy of your PTA's bylaws to refer to. And as always, there's more places you can go for additional information, but if you need help, if you're not finding the information that you need here, please reach out to your council or your district PTA for additional assistance. Remember, one of the biggest advantages of being in PTA is that there's always someone to ask for help. Okay, the role of a PTA treasurer. 3 most important functions of PTA treasurer are: you are an elected member of the board, you are the most senior manager of PTA funds, not the only manager, but the most senior, and you are the chair of the budget committee. Immediately upon election, or as soon as possible thereafter, the board-elect needs to meet. The board-elect needs to designate members to be a budget committee that is chaired by the treasurer-elect. You need to do things like survey, even informally, your school's needs. As a board, what are your goals going to be? You need to keep in mind the 3-to-1 rule that we'll talk about in a little bit. Does your board need any training? Do you have questions about how to do your jobs that you need help answering? And as a financial officer, what financial reports are you responsible for and when? It's important to transition with your outgoing treasurer whenever possible. Sometimes it's not possible, and that's an unfortunate circumstance that we are all too familiar with, but as much as possible, please transition with your outgoing treasurer. You need to know what accounting system the PTA is currently using. You need to know what reports are currently being provided in the format, because not everyone does their reports exactly the same way. You will need audited records from the term prior to you. You will need supplies. Even if you're doing all of your accounting work online, every treasurer will need some supplies. Supplies include the checkbook, the records from the previous treasurer, a copy of the accounting program if you're using one that's a local program and not cloud-based, login and password information. This is something that often is not people don't remember to hand over. You need more than the login and password information for just the accounting software. You also need login and password information for other things, perhaps government agencies, so that you can file tax filings. Okay, all other treasurer materials, whatever those may be, those get passed on. You also need to have an annual financial report and tax filings done. Now we'll talk more in detail about both of those items, but the key here to remember is that it is the outgoing treasurer's responsibility to complete the annual financial report and reconcile the last bank statement. However, it's not uncommon for that to not be done by the outgoing treasurer. If that's the case for you, then as the incoming treasurer, you'll need to make sure that that's done. The same thing applies to tax filings. It is the responsibility of the outgoing treasurer to make sure that tax filings are completed. But if that has not occurred, then it is your responsibility as the incoming treasurer to make sure that tax returns are completed on time. And I would just like to pause here and point out that I did not say it is your job to complete the tax filings. Not every treasurer is going to be able to complete tax filings for every PTA, nor should you. Some PTAs do need assistance from a professional, either a CPA or a certified tax preparer, and that is a perfectly acceptable thing and an acceptable expense for your budget. So it's not the treasurer's job necessarily, although you can, to complete the tax filings. It is your job to make sure the tax filings are done. Okay. Bank accounts. You need to know who the approved signers are for your account. Again, you're going to need to check your bylaws. Your bylaws will tell you which elected officers are supposed to be signers on your bank account. And the only group of people that can change who is an approved signer on your bank account is your association. That cannot be done by the board. So to change bank account signers, if an officer who was previously a signer is no longer going to be a signer, and to add yourself if you weren't a signer before, you're going to need to make a trip to the bank in all likelihood. You're going to need a copy of your complete election minutes that shows not only who was elected into which position, but that clearly names which officers are signers on the bank account. It's also helpful typically for those minutes to indicate which current signers at the time of the election are going to come off the bank account at the end of their term. When you do go to the bank and change signers, it's very important that you make sure that all previous signers who are no longer authorized to be signers on the PTA's account have been removed. Occasionally we run into fun stories from people who go to a bank and they discover that there are people still as listed as signers on the bank account who haven't even been in the PTA for 5 or more years. So make sure that that's not your PTA and that the only people listed as signers on the account are those currently authorized to be signers on the account. And remember that all accounts, you must have signers changed. When a signer is removed or a signer is added, it needs to be done to all PTA bank accounts, not just specific ones. Okay. Bank statements. It's very, very important that if you're getting physically mailed bank statements, they go to the school address or to your PTA's PO box. Bank statements should never, under any circumstances, be mailed to the personal address of a signer on the account. And I mean never under any circumstances. If you're not a PTA that is getting paper statements, because that's a thing that's going the way of the dinosaurs more and more, then you need to have what we call view-only access for someone who is a non-signer on your bank account. It's important that a non-signer, someone who doesn't have any access to do anything with the funds, is able to view and print your bank statements if you don't have paper statements being mailed. okay? This is an insurance requirement that bank statements be opened, reviewed, dated, and signed monthly by a non-check signer. This is an insurance requirement. If you do not follow this requirement, the insurance company may not allow a claim in the event you have some kind of loss. It's fairly simple to, at the same time that the bank statements are opened, to do what we call a quick 5-minute audit. And there's more information provided about that, both in the toolkit and in our audit workshop, which is available for you to view during this convention. Okay. It's also important to remember that you need to be looking at those bank statements each month to ensure that all deposits have been credited correctly and that any checks that have been written have cleared, and so that you keep very close track of which checks have not cleared the bank. Okay. Any checks that are more than 90 days old and have not cleared need to be researched. And when I say research, that usually means reaching out to the person or the business to whom the check was written and inquiring as to whether or not they still have the check or if they need the check to be reissued. If you do need to reissue a check, it's always recommended that you issue a stop payment on the original check to prevent anyone from being able to deposit the original check and debit your account for that. There are bank fees for stop payments, and those are an acceptable PTA expense that you should be budgeting for. So not only do you need to open and review the bank statement, or have the bank statement opened and then you review it after it's been signed, but you also need to reconcile the bank statement to your ledger that shows you what your PTA has spent and what your PTA has brought in income. Those do not always show the same thing, because sometimes it takes, as we know, a month, 2, possibly 3 for someone to cash a check that you've written. It also sometimes takes the bank several days to record deposits or give you access to those funds. And then there are oftentimes electronic transactions. If your PTA receives donations from Amazon Smile, for example, those will show up on your bank statement, but you might not have recorded those yet in your ledger. So it's important to reconcile the differences between your bank statement and your treasurer's records in the ledger. And you need to make sure that you do this monthly. If you're using financial software, it's very easy to do, and most of them will walk you through it, and it takes only a few minutes. It's important that the reconciliation report, that the bank reconciliation report, however you do it, if it's on your paper bank statement or if you're doing it in your financial software, it needs to be reviewed and signed by a non-check signer. And this needs to be done monthly again. So this is an insurance requirement, and insurance claims may be denied if you do not have your bank accounts and your bank statements and your ledger reconciled monthly, and those reconciliations reviewed and signed by a non-check signer. This is in addition to the requirement of having your bank statement opened, reviewed, and signed by a non-check signer. This is for everyone's protection. This is to make sure that, everybody is aware of all of the transactions that are occurring on the bank account, that there's nothing happening that isn't being reported to the board and association. And it's to make sure that you are doing your job as treasurer, and that's clear to everybody because you have somebody who's not a signer who's reviewing everything monthly. Let's talk for a minute about organizing your PTA records. You are going to have a lot of records as the treasurer or the financial secretary. You will have the most records of any PTA officer. It's important that you keep them organized, and it's important that you know how to access them at all times, because you will get questions and you will have to go back and look at things or research things periodically. So it's really important to keep your records organized and in one place, if at all possible. We recommend setting up your records from the point of view of the auditor. So keeping in mind what somebody who doesn't work with these records every day is going to be looking for when they go through to review your books for PTA audit. And you can find information about PTA audits in our toolkit, including a very helpful checklist that the auditors are supposed to follow, and which I have found is a good guide as a treasurer to make sure that I'm including all of the things in my treasurer's books that need to be there. Okay, some of those really important things are treasurer's reports. Treasurer's reports will be issued for every meeting of the board and the association. All of your bank statements and reconciliations, which we just talked about, should all have someone else's signature and date on them because they've been reviewed by a non-signer. All of your cash verification forms and deposit records. All authorizations for payments and receipts attached to those authorizations for payments. You must keep all of these things. We have in our toolkit a record retention schedule that tells you how long different records need to be kept, but under no circumstances can any of these records be gotten rid of until after your term has ended. So you must keep every treasurer's record at the minimum until your term is over. So most of these things require being kept for 2 or 3 years. So please review the record retention schedule and make sure that you are retaining not only the records during your term, but afterwards and handing them over to your successor as required by law. Most of the records that have to be retained we have to retain them for a period of time because a government agency has specified that. It's not just that PTAs want you to have lots and lots of records in your garage. This is an unofficial list. This is not something that you have to have every single thing here, but it would be best if you did. So when I have been a treasurer, this is what I had in my treasurer's binder. And I know I'm dating myself because I had a binder. And a lot of people have records that are now electronic, much more than ever before, but that's okay. So make sure that you have things like your PTA calendar and your school calendar, because you will need to refer to those. You need agendas from every board meeting and association meeting, minutes from every board meeting and association meeting. Again, you will need to refer to the minutes as a financial officer to go back and verify that things that you're about to write checks for were authorized for funds to be spent on. Okay, don't rely on your memory because trust me, you end up in trouble that way. Go back, check the minutes, make sure that things have been recorded in the minutes appropriately, that your treasurer's reports and things are being reported as they're supposed to be, and keep copies of all of those in your treasurer's records. You're going to need a copy of the budget, both the one that's originally approved by the association and any updated versions that the association approves changes to throughout the year. I also keep copies of budget versus actuals, which is basically a report as I go through the year of how our spending and our income compare to what we estimated. You need a copy of the annual financial report from the prior fiscal year, copy of tax filings, copies of audits. There should be 2 audits per year, so you should have a mid-year audit and a year-end audit in every treasurer's record for 1 fiscal year. You need treasurer's reports for the executive board meetings and for the association meetings, all of your bank statements and bank reconciliations, cash verification forms, payment authorization forms with receipts attached, bylaws, keep a copy of your bylaws with your treasurer's records if at all possible, and then conflict of interest and whistleblower forms. These are, this is a form that you can find in the PTA toolkit. It's not required that the treasurer keep this form, but it's recommended that the treasurer be the person who keeps this form with their records.
Can I interject a little bit into this one?
Please do.
All right. Some people always ask when we do trainings about why do I need to keep some of this paperwork if it's uploaded into my PTEZ? And the simple answer is the backup you have with the hard copies of some of these forms, such as your taxes and your annual financial reports, should be kept because people in the next board may accidentally overwrite your taxes or your annual report when they're uploading their own, because sometimes they don't notice that the year at the top of the report is incorrect. And once it's been overwritten, there's no way to recover it. So the hard copy is your backup in case there is ever a problem.
Absolutely. It's really, really important that you maintain copies as much as possible, multiple copies of your files. So, but even if you've uploaded something in My PTEZ, that doesn't preclude the obligation that you have to make sure that that document is still retained for the required amount of time as specified in the document retention schedule. So if you have paper copies already, hang on to those until your PTA will no longer need them. And for the record, tax filings are part of your PTA's permanent record. So tax filings do not ever get to be thrown out.
Melinda, I'm sorry. Can I interject something just about what I found easy in organizing my records as a treasurer for audit purposes?
Please do.
I did organize things by month. So I had either in a binder or in my file, the month of January, I had the treasurer's report, the bank statements, all deposits, all cash verification forms, and backup for all of those forms. And then the payment authorizations with all the receipts and backup attached by month, so that when it came time to do the audit, I could hand the auditor 6 months worth of files that had everything they needed for that audit. And it made it a lot easier for them when they were doing the audit, because they had all the paper. It was easier to gather the information for them, as well as easier for the auditors. So just something I found easy to do.
And see, that's interesting, because I've always, as a treasurer, that record keeping things by month, I've had records given to me that way. And I've personally found it to be very unfriendly for me to use, primarily because I can never remember whether we did something in January or February. So I've found that having all the cash verification forms together is easier for me, but I think this is one of those stylistic differences. There is no right or wrong way to organize your records, as long as you have all the records that are required and you keep them organized.
Yes.
Your organizational system can be unique to you, but it needs to be there. And if it is unique and not obvious, make sure that you explain it to your auditor when you hand over the records.
Yes.
Okay, your first association meeting of the year is a big meeting for financial officers. You have a lot going on. You will need to be presenting the annual financial report for the prior year. The annual financial report is a report of budget versus actuals for the entire fiscal year. So if your PTA's fiscal year begins on July 1st and ends on June 30th, your annual financial report will show what you budgeted versus what you actually brought in income and expenses for that entire time period. If this should have been done by the outgoing treasurer, but if not, remember, this needs to be done prior to the first association meeting, and you will need to do it as the incoming officer. You also will present at your first association meeting of the year, your year-end audit. So this is the audit that covers the last 6 months of the prior year. Again, if your fiscal year runs June 1st to July 30th, or excuse me, July 1st to June 30th, I can talk today, then your year-end audit would cover January 1st through June 30th. The audit should have been presented to an audit review committee if necessary, and then to your board prior to it being presented at your first association meeting. You also need to present your budget and fundraisers and programs that your PTA expects to hold during the year. Some PTAs prefer to present these separately Some PTAs prefer to present the budget first and then discuss the fundraisers and programs that are listed in the budget separately. It's really okay to do it either way. The important thing is that all your fundraisers and your programs have to be approved by your association, and so does your budget. So it's important that we don't just put a budget up and then not talk about the fundraisers that we're planning to do and the programs that we're planning to provide, and we just simply talk about the numbers in the budget. You will also present a treasurer's report at the first association meeting. You will present any checks or payments that need to be ratified by the association. And you will be releasing funds after you have approved your budget for the items that you expect to spend money on until your next association meeting. And we're going to go through all of these things in a little bit more detail here in just a moment. Okay, what's on your treasurer's report? Now we say treasurer's report in the singular, but you may actually have multiple reports for multiple accounts at every single meeting. And in fact, you're required to provide a report for every bank account at every meeting. It's really important that you include on your treasurer's reports, both for the association and for the board, the time period being covered, because it may not be obvious. For example, as a treasurer, if I have an association meeting happening on Friday, I may decide that I'm going to only be reporting accounts activity that occurs through the Wednesday prior, right? So there's going to be a 2-day gap between the time that I'm reporting on and the date of the association meeting. That's simply so that I can basically make sure that my reports are accurate and include all of the information through that time period. So it's important, though, that your treasurer's reports include the report period, and the report period should pick up where the previous treasurer's report left off. So if I had a treasurer's report for the association that ended on April 30th, my treasurer's report for the next association meeting would need to start on May 1st. You must, on your treasurer's reports, include all receipts and expenditures. Make sure that anything that's happening in your bank account that you're not necessarily seeing except on bank statements or occasionally via email is reported. I'm thinking here particularly of Amazon Smile. I've had to revise treasurer's reports a few times because I missed an Amazon Smile direct deposit to a bank account. And then I needed to go back and correct the treasurer's reports to make sure that that was documented. Your reports and your minutes should match. So your treasurer's reports will have a beginning balance and an ending balance, and the minutes should record that information, and they should match. If there's a discrepancy, you need to speak with the secretary and get that resolved, because the minutes are the official legal record of your PTA, and it is vital that they actually reflect the complete, accurate information on the PTA's finances. And then at the end of your treasurer's report, you're going to present any checks that have been written or any authorized online payments that need to be ratified or approved. Okay. Your budget committee, the treasurer-elect chairs, and the budget committee is appointed by the president-elect. It's really a best practice to have current PTA officers from the fiscal year that's coming to a close and incoming officers from the next board serve on the budget committee whenever possible, simply because you get better continuity of information that way. So it's perfectly okay for the outgoing treasurer to serve on the budget committee with the incoming treasurer, but remember that the incoming treasurer, the treasurer-elect, is the chairperson, and they are in charge of the committee. You need to base your proposed budget on your financial plan for the year for your PTA. And what's that based on? That's based on your goals and the programs that your PTA wants to provide. Okay. I want to say for a minute, there's always a debate, and it happens every year in every PTA, between things that have been done for a long time and new proposals. And for most PTAs, there's room for both. You do not have to stop doing something simply because you've done it for forever. If it's a program that still works for your school, is enjoyed by your families, meets your community's needs, etc. Neither do you have to give up putting in place any new programs simply because you have so many programs that you've been doing for a while that work. There's always room for both new and old in your PTA's programs for the year and in your budget. The balancing act can be kind of tricky, but try to be open both to new ideas, and sometimes there's ways to do things that we've been doing for a long time, but do them better. And that's never a bad thing. Your budget committee should come up with your proposed budget for the following fiscal year. You need to make sure that your proposed budget includes information from past budgets and plans to the degree possible. This next year may be a little challenging because I don't think any of us really have had a normal year this current year with the pandemic. But to the greatest degree possible, look at past budgets and the history of your PTA to kind of get an estimate of where your PTA might be headed financially for the coming year, and try and balance your probable income with your probable expenses. It doesn't have to match exactly if your PTA has some reserves, but it's always, always best to not plan to deficit spend unless it's unavoidable. So make sure that what you're proposing for your PTA income in the budget is sufficient to meet the needs and pay for all of your proposed expenses. The timeline for this. So we've mentioned a couple times that you should be working on the budget, hopefully shortly after you've been elected for the next term. You're going to bring your proposed budget to the board. You're going to present your proposed budget at the last meeting of the year, or the current treasurer is. It's okay if it's the current treasurer who presents it to the association. But you want to make sure that the budget is preliminarily approved before the fiscal year ends. And this is important so that your PTA has some kind of spending plan and roadmap and authorization in place before school lets out for the summer. You also want to make sure that you have authorized funds needed over the summer to be released. So sometimes PTAs refer to that as, I authorize the board to pay bills, and that's the motion. Sometimes it's very specific. We authorize the board to pay items from the following budget categories. It's really depends on your PTA and the level of detail and funding that's needed over the summer. But you do need to have some kind of association permission to spend money over the summer as an incoming board. Then over the summer, you're going to revise the budget. You're going to have a better estimate of your income and your expenses. Hopefully, for example, this summer, you'll know whether your school will be meeting completely in person or if hybrid learning is going to continue in your area. Those kinds of things can make a big difference. And you're going to present a revised budget to what is now the current board, what was previously the board-elect. Okay. And then at your first association meeting of the year, you're going to present that revised budget to your association. Now, this revised budget may look shockingly similar to the preliminary budget that you proposed and was approved a few months ago, and that's okay. It means you're really good at estimating. So kudos to you. But it should have a little bit of difference because it should for certain include the exact amount of funds that were carried over from the prior fiscal year in the bank account. So it should never be 100% the same as your previously approved preliminary budget, but if it's 99%, that's okay. But don't be afraid to make changes over the summer as you see that they're needed before you present it at the first association meeting of the year. And then this is where I want to remind you that your budget is a living document. I always tell people, if I was really, really good at predicting things, I wouldn't be in PTA. I would have won the lottery a long time ago. So you're going to need to change your budget throughout the course of the year. It's a living thing. You have to make changes to it. That doesn't mean you're bad at what you're doing. It actually means the opposite. It means that you're doing your job as a financial officer of the PTA to make sure that your PTA is being fiscally responsible, and you're keeping up with transparency to the board and the association, and making sure that your PTA is on sound financial footing at all times. So never view needing to make a budget change as a bad thing. It's something that will happen, and you will need to do it, and it's supposed to happen.
It's built into the bylaws even, because there is a section about having unbudgeted expenses and how to deal with them.
Yes. Yes. So it's going to happen. You should plan for it to happen, and never ever view it as a bad thing. You always want to adjust the budget as needed. All right, more specifically in the budget, there are some things that every PTA should make sure they have. And these are some broad categories, but they're important. So make sure that your budget has all of these. So the first one is carryover funds per the audit. So this is how much money was in your PTA's bank account at the end of the year, right? So it's really important to know what you're starting with. Then your budget needs to include all income from all expected sources. Don't forget to put Amazon Smile as an income category. If your PTA has an Amazon Smile account, make sure that you're including income from all expected sources. Some typical income categories would be your fundraisers that you're holding, donations, and you're going to have membership income for the portion of membership dues that stays at your PTA. Then we have funds not belonging to the unit, which funds not belonging to your PTA, income. So these are monies that you collect, but that don't actually belong to your PTA and don't stay with your PTA. Typically, there's two kinds of these funds. The first is the per capita portion of dues from members that belong to your council, your district, to state and national PTA. And the second is any kind of Founders Day free will offerings that come in, a portion of which also does not stay with your PTA and belongs to other PTAs upstream, council, district, state, national. So you need to make, absolutely.
I'm sorry. On these funds, it's important to think of them as PTA funds not belonging to the unit, as opposed to booster club funds that you deposited for that booster club because they didn't have an account yet. That is not supposed to happen. So
correct.
Yeah,
correct. These are funds that belong to a PTA, just not your PTA. So that is a very important clarification. Thank you, Kathy. So it is important that you separate those out. For example, if your membership dues are, $10, only some of those funds are going to stay at your PTA. You need to consult your bylaws to see how much of that $10 belongs to your PTA versus how much is per capita dues that you need to forward on to the next level PTA, either your council or your district. And make sure that you separate those things in your budget. Your next big broad category is going to be expenses. It seems obvious, but I have actually had submitted to me people who have given me budgets that only had income. They did not list any expenses on them. So it's obviously not obvious to some people that you need to include all your expenses in your budget. You may have 10 different categories for expenses. You may have 100. It will depend on the size of your PTA and the kinds of programs that you're offering. It's important to make sure that every program is listed in expenses if you're going to have any expenses for it. And every fundraiser should be listed in expenses if you're going to have expenses for it. The only kind of fundraiser I'm aware of that doesn't have any expenses associated with it at all is a direct donation campaign. But you could argue that if you're making copies and sending out mailings for that part of that direct donation campaign, that those actually are expenses for that fundraiser. So I think I would say some fundraisers may have very minimal expenses, but fundraisers typically have expenses, and you need to make sure that they're listed.
And Melinda, I've had the opposite problem with some budgets where I've gotten budgets that only have expenses listed and nowhere does it say where that money is coming from. So even if you are not anticipating getting any income this year, you're not going to fundraise or anything, you need to specify somewhere on your budget that you're using money that already exists from your bank account.
Correct. Absolutely. And this is why, in case you guys were wondering, I just want to comment, Kathy and Laura both wanted me to do the bulk of this presentation and then just chime in as they wanted to. And since I am the current treasurer, it is my job to do this presentation to the degree that's needed. And so they just get to chime in when I'm missing something or they have something important to add. And it's not just because I'm an egomaniac and I wanted to talk this entire time. So I just wanted to be clear in case you were wondering. All right, next category of things to make sure is in your budget is your carryover funds for next year. You never, ever, ever want to leave the next term's board and association with no funds or funds that are so little that they're not sufficient for them to start their year. So it's part of the budget because you need to plan to leave money for the next term. This is part of maintaining the continuity of your PTA, and it's crucially important. Okay. Typically, you will also have an unallocated line item in your budget. This is not supposed to be a giant amount of money. It's supposed to be a small amount of money to cover any kind of small but unexpected expense that may come up during the course of the year. So most PTAs that I know put a few $100s into unallocated, not thousands of dollars. Because if you're talking about large sums of money that weren't budgeted, you need to make sure those go back to your association and your budget gets updated. Line items get added, monies get transferred between one category and another, et cetera. So unallocated is really for small, unexpected expenses.
Belinda,
Yes, ma'am.
on carryover funds, it's also important to remember you're not only giving or leaving enough money for the unit to function and as startup funds for their fall activities, but if you have any invoices that you know or any expenditures that you know haven't come in or will not be received by the end of the fiscal year, say you have you're paying for buses for field trips. This year, obviously, that won't be an issue, but in years past and sometimes and in the future, where the school district has paid for buses, but they don't invoice you before the end of the year. You have to think about those expenses and not only include enough money for startup funds for activities at the beginning of the year, but also to cover any unpaid expenditures from your term, so that, or from that current fiscal year, so that you don't drain the funds down for the unit.
That is absolutely correct. And it's important to think about not just those kinds of expenses, but also other kinds of expenses that are typically going to happen at the beginning of your term, right? You don't want to leave your PTA short of funds for the next year so that they can't afford to pay their insurance dues until they've had some kind of fundraiser. So it's critically important that when you're calculating unallocated funds, that you take into account the typical kinds of activities, both expenses and income generating, that occur at the beginning of a fiscal year for your PTA and your school, and you leave next year's board sufficient funds to be able to allow them to operate normally. The final category of funds that you need to make sure are included in your budget are funds not belonging to the unit expenses. Again, these are PTA funds that don't belong to your particular PTA. So when you receive those per capita dues that belong to PTAs upstream from you, you are then going to need to forward those dues to those PTAs. In PTA, we refer to this as going through channels. So your PTA would write a check for the portion of membership per capita dues you've received that don't belong to your PTA, and you would send it to your district if you're out of council, or to your council if you're in a council. Okay, it's really important to keep this separate from your PTA's program and fundraising expenses, because again, these are funds that do not belong to your PTA, and you're essentially doing what we call passing them through. It's also important to pay attention, your funds not belonging, income and expenses should match, because all of the money you received that doesn't belong to you should be sent on. So if there is a discrepancy between those two, you need to investigate and figure out what happened. And typically it's because maybe you've received some membership dues that you forgot that needed to be sent forward. So that's the most common reason, but any kind of discrepancy between those two amounts should be investigated. All right, another important duty of the treasurer is monitoring the budget. Remember, we talked about the fact that it's a living document. So it is absolutely going to change, and you need to stay on top of it. Now, it is not just your responsibility to monitor it and decide when changes need to be made, but the executive board can't exercise their responsibility to help monitor the budget if they don't get good information. So you need to make sure that you as a financial officer are providing the information to the executive board so that they can monitor the budget with you. If they don't have data, they can't make good decisions. So to that end, we recommend that you provide a budget versus actuals update at least quarterly. So that would be at least 4 times during the year. I personally recommend that you provide it as often as possible. If it's possible for you to provide a budget versus actuals update, and for most of us it is with financial software, every meeting, then you should do that. There is no maximum number of times you can update that information and provide it to your board and association. You are still the chair of the budget committee as the treasurer. And so it is still your responsibility to make sure that the budget is meeting your association's needs. And if you need to call a meeting of the budget committee to make significant changes, you should do so. It's important to keep in mind that you need to be assessing the budget and whether changes are needed frequently, but in particular, you want to make sure that no changes are needed to the budget prior to association meetings, because the association is the organization that has the authority to change your budget and authorize changes to your expenses and your income and all of that. So you need to make sure that any changes that are needed to the budget are presented to the association in a timely manner. Part of keeping track and monitoring the budget is making sure that your expenses are staying within the budget, right? We've all had this happen where something came in and it just cost more than anybody had planned for. That happens. If you have something that you receive a reimbursement request or a payment authorization form for an amount that exceeds what's been budgeted and released, then you need to hold that until you get approval to spend the additional funds over what was budgeted. The budget is approval for the up to the budgeted amount. It doesn't include the activity as a whole with no dollar figure attached. In other words, if we say that we're going to spend $200 on the end of the year picnic and somebody else comes in and presents a receipt for $250, that $50 has not been authorized and you can't write them a check for that. So it's up to the association to determine how much money they ultimately want to spend on that end of the year picnic. Sometimes you might have the wonderful problem of having what we call excess income. And there's really no such thing, but your fundraiser may do something fantastic. You may get some kind of wonderful donation or group of donations, and you may end up with income that you hadn't planned to have. So it's really important when that happens that you also take a look at the budget, because sometimes you might need to eliminate a fundraiser. Maybe you don't need to have that catalog sale in March that you had planned to have because your fall fundraiser did so well. It's never a bad thing to be able to provide programs to your families and ask for less money. So keep that in mind as well. You can adjust your budget, remove fundraisers, add programs, put more money into programs if you have more income than you've expected. And again, remember that in order to revise the budget, you need a vote of the association. So make sure that you are ready for those when you have association meetings. Some of you may have association meetings frequently. Others may only have 3 or 4 association meetings a year. So it's very important that you make sure that the budget, any changes to the budget that are needed, are presented timely to the association. And you always want to present those things to the board first. So keep that in mind, that you need to backdate the timing of these things so that you present information to the board about proposed budget changes before it goes to the association. We don't like to surprise our officers when we can avoid it. Okay. Now we're going to move on to a little bit about dealing with income. And I know that this sounds kind of crazy in the current environment, but hopefully most of this will be applicable for the coming year. The first thing we want to make sure we tell you is you may not have a petty cash box. You may not have a petty cash box. A petty cash box is, petty cash is money that is not kept in a bank. It is kept somewhere else, and it's used for small minor expenses on an ongoing basis. We don't do that in PTA. That's not anything that's acceptable. Now, you can get money out of the bank for a fundraiser or other activity where you're going to need to have a cash box, but there is a process for pulling that money out and redepositing those funds that were used as startup cash. And it doesn't involve keeping that money sitting around for months at a time with no records, which is typically what a petty cash box is. So don't have a petty cash box. It's also important that we have 2 people counting funds that are received at all times, minimum 2 people. Okay, should never be one individual counting funds. Sometimes you may have more than 2 people, that's fine. Having more than 2 people is not a problem as long as everyone comes up with the same numbers when you're done adding things up. But make sure you always have at least 2 people. Those people may not be related. And when I say they may not be related, I mean they may not be related by blood, marriage, or living in the same household. So I may not count money with my husband or my children, and you cannot count money with your roommate. So it always needs to be someone that is not related to you by blood, marriage, or living in the same household. You always need to use a cash verification form. And I will confess that I've always been a little nonplussed by the term cash verification form, because what about checks? But cash verification forms include cash and checks. Okay. Cash verification forms are the forms we use to record all manner of income, cash and check. It doesn't matter if someone's giving you 1,000 pennies, or if they're giving you a check for $5, or if your PTA just had the best popcorn sale on a Friday afternoon you've ever had and you have $5,000 in cash to count. I don't even know how that would be possible, but we can dream. You always use a cash verification form when you have income coming in, and it always needs 2 people counting, and those same 2 people need to sign that cash verification form. You may have more than 2 people, but you should never have a cash verification form with fewer than 2 signatures. You need to make sure that you deposit your funds immediately. This is really, really important. It's really hard sometimes, I know, to get into the bank during banking hours, particularly right now. But You can always make a deposit at a night drop or an outside ATM if your bank allows that, but it's critically important that you don't keep PTA funds hanging around after they've been counted and confirmed. You need to get those into the bank as soon as possible. That said, I always remind people, you personally are more important than any amount of PTA money. So you should never, ever do anything that puts your health and safety at risk. And if that means that you have to delay taking money to the bank for a few hours, or you have to have someone else take the money to the bank and deposit it, then that's what you need to do. But your health and safety are of paramount importance. So never, ever jeopardize your safety to make a deposit. And finally, you have to make sure that you maintain a paper trail. This is critically important. You need to know where that money came from in terms of how did it appear in the PTA's bank account. If somebody wrote a check, was it for a fundraiser? Was it just a simple donation? You need to know where the funds came from. So you need to make sure that you maintain a paper trail. That includes making sure that your deposit receipts are attached to your cash verification forms. Okay. Anyone who looks through the treasurer's records, including the auditor, needs to be able to see that, yes, you and your fellow board member counted these funds and then they were deposited immediately in the bank. And the record of that deposit is both there attached to the cash verification form. And then if they flip to the bank statements, they can see that that deposit was in fact made. So it's really important to maintain that paper trail. I would like to add that it is acceptable to deposit funds mobily or electronically. If you have a deposit that is all checks, for example, and your bank allows electronic deposit, you may participate in that as PTA. Obviously, cash always needs to be deposited in person, but for checks, you may make mobile deposits or electronic deposits, but you still must use cash verification forms. Those funds still must be counted by 2 people, and you still have to maintain the full paper trail, including having some kind of deposit receipt. It is not sufficient for you to just see that the deposit shows up on the bank statement when it comes 3 weeks later. You must have some kind of verification that the deposit was made. So if that's the form of an email from your bank, that's fine. You attach that to your cash verification form, but you do have to still have the same paper trail, the same records proving that the deposit was in fact made. This is an example of a cash verification form that's currently in our toolkit. It's been revised over the years. Hopefully it's been improved with those revisions, but it is here. It is available for you to use. You do not have to use this particular form. Your PTA may have a version that has your logo at the top. You may prefer to have a different format. It's okay as long as it has the same information that this form contains. So you need places to record cash, you need places to record checks, you need to record what activity it's for, which PTA you are, and the date. It needs to have places for all of these totals. It's super important to be able to separate out for membership dues, which portions were dues, which portions were donations, because that matters when you're recording it in your financial records. And then down at the very bottom, you have signatures, and you have more signature lines than you will probably need, but it's always better to have more than not enough. And make sure that every cash verification form has 2 signatures. And we've gone over this, but it's so critically important that we want to make sure that we cover it and you really hear it. All receipts of monies require use of a cash verification form, whether that's 50 cents or $500 or $5,000. You have to use a cash verification form to record that income of funds. It must be signed by all who are counting, so at least 2 people. But if you have 3 or 4 people who are counting the funds with you, all those people should be signing on the cash verification form as well. If you are not the person who is taking custody of the funds and taking those to the bank, for example, if you are a committee chairman and you and one of your committee members have taken the funds and you've counted the funds and you've signed the cash verification form, and now you're going to hand those funds over to the treasurer, and the treasurer is going to take those funds to the bank, or maybe it's the financial secretary who's going to make the deposit, the person who is taking custody of the money needs to count the money while they're still with you. Okay. Or if you're receiving funds from someone who is bringing them to you to take to the bank to deposit, you need to count those funds in front of them while they're still there, and then countersign at the bottom that you have received those funds. It does occasionally happen that somebody will, miscount. It also occasionally happens that a check gets stuck in an envelope and it doesn't get pulled out. Or occasionally, you might miscount your cash, but you want to make sure that the person who's actually taking the funds to the bank has counted those funds to verify that they did receive. In fact, if the cash verification form says they received $500, that they received $500 and not $450, because the person who makes the deposit is ultimately responsible for that deposited amount matching the funds verified on the cash verification form. It's important that whoever is not taking custody of the funds and taking those funds to the bank keep a copy of the cash verification form. Okay. And this is important for primarily insurance purposes, because if I am taking the money to the bank and I get mugged on my way, heaven forbid, but if that happened and the only copy of the cash verification form was with the funds that just were stolen from me, now I don't have any way to prove to our insurance company how much money was stolen. So it's really important that copies of the cash verification form be kept by all people who signed it, and they should be kept until they can verify on the next treasurer's report that those funds were deposited. When I say a copy, it doesn't have to be a paper copy. These days, almost everybody has a cell phone capable of taking a picture. So it's perfectly fine for you to just snap a picture of the cash verification form that's been signed by all parties and keep that until, again, you verify on the next treasurer's report that that deposit was made. You can keep it forever if you'd really like, but at least until you verified that it's been deposited. And again, this is for the protection of your PTA, but also for the protection of the people taking the money to the bank, right? Okay, that is the end of part 1. Thank you so much.